Chapter 2. Jack. The news was conveyed to Aunt Mary through private advices from Mr. Stebbins, who had been hastily summoned to the city for purposes of bail. She was very angry indeed this time, primarily at the indignity done her flesh and blood by arresting it. Then, as she reread the lawyer's letter, other reflections crowded to the fore in her mind.
Funny, whatever could have made my boy get up and go downtown at 3 a.m. anyway? She said. Seems kind of queer, don't you think, Arethusa? Do you suppose he was ill and hunting for a drugstore?
Arethusa had been sent for the second day previous because Lucinda's youngest sister's youngest child had come down with scarlet fever, and the family wanted Lucinda to enliven the quarantine. Arethusa had sent invitations out for a dinner party, but she had recalled them and hastened to obey the summons. It was an evil hour for her, for she loved her brother and was mightily distressed at the bad news.
"I don't believe he can have been ill," she said at the top of her voice. "If he'd been ill, he wouldn't have had the strength to hit the cab driver so hard." "I don't blame him for hitting the cab driver," said Aunt Mary warmly. "As near as I can recollect, I've often wanted to do that myself. But I can't make out where he got the man to hit, or why he was there to hit him. I can't make rhyme or reason out of it. I wish we knew more. Well, I presume we will later."
Her surmise was correct. They knew much more later. They knew more from Mr. Stebbins, and they knew profusely more from the evening papers.
"I think our boy'd better have come home for his Easter," Aunt Mary remarked, with a species of angry undertow threading the current of her speech. "There's no sayin' what this will cost before we're done with it."
Arethusa choked. It was all so very terrible to her.
"What is it that the cabman wants, anyhow?" her aunt demanded presently.
"He doesn't want anything," yelled the unhappy sister. "He's going to die."
"Well, who is going to sue me then?"
"It's his wife. She wants $5,000 damages." Aunt Mary's lips tightened.
$5,000, she said with a bitter patience. "I can see that this is going to be an awful business. $5,000, dear, dear. I must say that wife sets a pretty high price on her husband. At least, according to my order of thinking, she does. From what I've seen of cabmen, I'd undertake to get her another just as good for 1/10 of the money any day."
Arethusa was silent, staring thoughtfully at the newspaper cuts of a great Tammany leader and a noted pugilist, which had been labeled as the principals in the family tragedy. Aunt Mary turned over another of the many papers received, and scanned its sensational columns afresh.
"Arethusa," she exclaimed suddenly, "do you know, I bet anything I know what this editor means to insinuate. It just strikes me that he's trying to give the impression that our boy's been drinking."
"Perhaps so," Arethusa screamed.
"Well, I don't believe it," said Aunt Mary firmly, "and I ain't going to believe it. And I ain't going to pay no $5,000 for no cabman's brains neither. You write to Mr. Stebbins to compromise on 2 or maybe 3.
She stopped and bit her lips and shook her head.
"I don't see why Jack grows up so hard," she murmured, half in anger and half in sorrow. "Edward and Henry never had such times. Oh, well," she sighed, "boys will be boys, I s'pose. And if this all results in the boys settling down, it'll be money well spent in the end, after all. Maybe, probably, most likely."
The days that followed were anxious days, but at last the cabman rallied and concluded not to die, and Jack went off yachting with a light heart and a choice collection of good advice from Mr. Stebbins and Aunt Mary. Nothing happened to mar his holiday. He ran a borrowed steam launch onto some rocks with rather heavy consequences to his aunt's exchequer, and returned from the West Indies so late that she never had a visit from him at all that summer. But, barring these slightly unwelcome incidents, he did remarkably well, and when he returned to college in the fall, he was regarded as having become, at last, a stable proposition. "I wonder whether our boy's comin' home for Christmas?" Aunt Mary asked her niece, Mary, as that happy period of family reunions drew near. Mary had come up to stay with her aunt while Lucinda went away to bury a second cousin. Mary was very different from Arethusa, having a voice that, when raised, was something between an icicle and a steam whistle, and a temperament so much on the order of her aunt's that neither could abide the other an hour longer than was absolutely necessary. But Arethusa had a sprained ankle, so there was no help for existing circumstances. "No, he isn't," said Mary, who had no patience at all with her brother, and showed it. "He's going west with the Glee Club." "With the She Club?" cried poor Aunt Mary in a fright. Mary explained. "I don't like the idea," said the old lady, shaking her head. "Something will be sure to happen. I can feel it running up and down my bones this minute." "Oh, if he can get into trouble, of course Jack will," said Mary cheerfully. Aunt Mary didn't hear her because she didn't raise her voice particularly. Besides, the old lady was absorbed for the nonce in the most dismal sort of prognostications. And they all came true, too. Something unfortunate beyond all expectations came to pass during the Glee Club's visit to Chicago, and the result was that, before the new year was well out of its incubator, Jack had papers in a breach of promise suit served on him. He wrote to Mr. Stebbins that it was all a joke, and had merely been a portion of that foam which a train of youthful spirits are apt to leave in their wake. But the girl stood solid for her rights, and, as she had never heard from her fiancé since the night of the dance, her family, who were rural but sharp, thought it would take at least $15,000 to patch the crack in her heart. If the news could have been kept from Aunt Mary until after Mr. Stebbins had looked into the matter, everything might have resulted differently. But the Chicago lawyer who had the case took good care that the wealthy aunt knew all as quickly as possible, and it seemed as if this was the final straw under which the camel must succumb. And Aunt Mary did appear to waver. $15,000? she cried, aghast. "Heaven help us! What next?" It was Lucinda who was seated calmly opposite at this crisis. "Do you suppose he really did it?" the aunt continued, after a minute of appalled consideration. "It's about the only thing he ain't never done," the tried and true servant answered, her tone more gratingly penetrative than ever. Aunt Mary eyed her sharply, not to say furiously. "I wish you'd give a plain answer when I ask you a plain question, Lucinda," she said coldly. "If you'd ever got a breach of promise suit in the early mail, you'd know how I feel. Probably." "I ain't a doubt but what he done it," Lucinda screamed out. "And if I was her, and he wouldn't marry me after saying he would, I'd sue him for $100,000 and think I let him off cheap then." Aunt Mary deigned to smile faintly over the subtlety of this speech, but the next minute she was frowning blacker than ever. "A girl from Kalamazoo, too, just up in Chicago for a week, just up in Chicago long enough to come down on me for $15,000. Maybe she'll take 5,000 instead, Lucinda remarked.
Maybe,
ejaculated her mistress in fine scorn.
Maybe. Well, if you don't talk as if money was sweet peas and would dry up if it wasn't picked.
Lucinda screwed up her face. Aunt Mary gave her one awful look.
You get me some paper in my desk, Lucinda, she said. I think it's about time I was taking a hand in it myself. I've been pretty patient, and I don't see as it's helped matters any. Now I'm going to write that boy a letter that'll settle him and his cats, and his cooks, and his cabmen, and his Kalamazoo just once for all. I guess I can do what I set out to do, pretty generally, most always.
Lucinda brought the desk, and Aunt Mary frowned fearfully and began to write the letter. It developed very strongly. As her pen sized up the situation in black and white, the old lady seemed to realize the iniquities of the case more and more plainly, and as the letter grew, her wrath grew also. The whole came in the end to a threat, made in good earnest, to take a very serious step indeed if any more foolishness developed. Aunt Mary prided herself on her granite-like will. She had full faith in her ability to slay her nearest and dearest if it seemed right and best to do so. She sealed her letter tight, stuck the stamp on square and hard, and bid Lucinda convey it to Joshua and tell him never to quit it until he saw it safe on to the evening train. "She's awful mad at him for sure this time," said Lucinda after she had delivered her message, and while Joshua was considering the front and back of the letter with a deliberateness born of long servitude. "I should think she would be," he said. As nearly all of Jack's private difficulties were printed in every newspaper in America, Joshua naturally was on the inside of all their history. "She scrinched up her face just awful over that letter," Lucinda continued. "I'm sure I wish he'd a been by to a taken warnin'." "He ain't got nothing to really fret over," said Joshua serenely. "He knows it, and I know it, and you know it too." "You don't know nothin' of the sort," said Lucinda. "She's madder'n usual this time. She's good and mad. You mark my words, if he goes off on another spree this spring, he'll get cut out of her will." Joshua laughed. "You mark my words," rasped Lucinda, shaking her finger in witch-like warning. Joshua laughed again. "Them laughs best what laughs last," said Aunt Mary's handmaiden. She turned away and then returned to give Joshua a look that proved that the peppery mistress had inculcated some cayenne into the souls of those about her. "You mark my words, them laughs best what laughs last, and there'll be little grinnin' for him if he ain't a chalk walker for one while now." Joshua laughed. But, as a matter of fact, Jack's situation was suddenly become extremely precarious.
"There ain't no sense in it,"
said Aunt Mary to herself, with an emphasis that screwed her face up until she looked quite like Lucinda.
"That life those young men lead on their little vacations is to blame for everything. Cities are wells of iniquity. They're full of all kinds of doin's that respectable people wouldn't be seen at. And I'm proud to say that I haven't been in one myself for 25 years. I'm a great believer in keeping out of trouble, and if Jack had just stuck to college and let towns go, he'd never have met the cabman and the Kalamazoo girl, and I'd have overlooked the cook and the cat. As it is, my patience is done. If he goes into one more scrape, he'll be done too. I mean what I say, so my young man had better take warnin'. Probably, most likely, pretty certainly."
End of chapter 2.